The microphone feedback lasted about 2 seconds before the room went quiet. That kind of quiet is specific. Not the quiet of a room waiting for something good. The quiet of a room that has just understood something is wrong and hasn't yet decided how to respond. 214 people. White tablecloths. Centerpieces I had spent 4 months choosing. My husband's hand finding mine under the table because he felt the temperature in the room shift before I did. My best friend's name is Nadia. She had been my best friend for 11 years. She was standing at the microphone in the dress I had chosen for her, holding a glass of champagne, smiling in a way that did not match the words coming out of her mouth. She had been speaking for about 90 seconds before I understood what she was doing. The speech started normally. Nadia and I had been friends since our first year of university. She had stories about me. The audience laughed at the right moments. My mother, seated 2 tables to my left, was already reaching for a tissue. My new husband, whose name is James, was leaning back in his chair with the relaxed smile of a man who believed the best part of the evening was unfolding. Then Nadia said she wanted to share something she thought everyone at the wedding deserved to know. The way she said deserved was the first signal. Not the word itself, but the weight she placed on it. Like she had been saving the weight for this exact moment in front of exactly this many people. She said that the woman sitting at the head table was not who most people in the room thought she was. She said she had known me longer than almost anyone there and felt an obligation, as my oldest and closest friend, to be honest about what that meant. What followed was 4 minutes of carefully constructed revelation dressed as concern. She talked about a relationship I had before James. A situation from 5 years earlier that had ended badly and that Nadia had been present for in the complicated way that best friends are present for the worst versions of your behavior. She described specific things I had done during that period. Things I was not proud of. Things that were true in the way that the worst moments of anyone's worst year are true, stripped of context and chronology and the full account of what was happening around them. She said she loved me but felt the people who loved James deserved to know who they were really welcoming into the family. She raised her glass. She said congratulations to both of us. She smiled. The feedback from the microphone when she set it down was the second sound in a room that had gone completely still. James's hand was still holding mine. I felt the grip change slightly, not release. Just a different quality of holding. My mother had put the tissue down. His mother, a measured woman named Patricia who had been warm and steady through the entire engagement, was looking at the table in front of her. I looked at Nadia. She was walking back to her seat with the composure of someone who had completed a task. She sat down and picked up her fork like nothing had shifted. Like the room was the same room it had been 5 minutes ago. It was not the same room. I am going to describe exactly what I did in the next 4 minutes because people have asked me about it many times since and I want to be precise. I did not cry. I did not stand up immediately. I did not look around the room to assess the damage or look at James for instruction on how to respond. I sat with my hand in my husband's hand and I breathed and I let the 4 minutes pass. Then I stood up. I asked James's brother, who was seated closest to the microphone, to bring it to me. He did it without hesitation because the look on my face apparently communicated that hesitation was not an option. I stood at my own wedding with the microphone in my hand and I told my story. Not all of it. Not the version that required 200 people to sit through the kind of disclosure that belongs in a therapist's office. I told the part that provided the context Nadia had deliberately removed. I told it in 5 minutes in a clear voice that did not break. I described the period she had referenced and what was actually happening during it. I named the things I had done and why and what came after. I talked about accountability and growth in terms specific enough that the room understood this was not a deflection. Then I said that I had spent 11 years believing Nadia was my closest friend, that I had given her the most important role in the most important day of my life because I trusted her with both. That what she had just done told me something I needed to know and I was grateful to know it now rather than later. I thanked everyone for being there. I thanked James for the way his hand had stayed in mine. I put the microphone down and sat back down and looked at my husband. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that only I could hear, that he was very glad he had married me. The room slowly came back to itself. Music started again. People found each other's eyes and found enough of a foundation to continue. The night did not become what it was supposed to be, but it became something. Something that functioned and held despite what had been done to it. Nadia left the reception within the hour. I did not watch her go. I was dancing with my husband. But I knew what came next would need to be handled carefully, and I intended to handle it exactly right. James and I did not talk about it the night of the wedding. We had agreed on this without discussing it, which was the kind of agreement that becomes possible when two people have learned each other well enough that some things move between them without words. We were at a hotel. We had 2 glasses of wine from the minibar. We sat on the edge of the bed and I told him the full version of the story Nadia had referenced, the parts I hadn't said into the microphone and the parts I had, and he listened without interrupting until I was done. He said the story I had told him made sense of the person he had watched stand up at her own wedding and take the microphone back. I thanked him. He said there was nothing to thank him for. We talked for a long time that night. Not just about Nadia and what she had done, but about the period she had weaponized and what it had actually been. James knew the outline because I had told him early in our relationship. The details he heard that night were fuller but consistent with what he already knew about who I had been at my worst and who I had become since. He said none of it changed anything for him. I believed him because he was not the kind of man who said things he did not mean. We flew to our honeymoon destination the next morning. 10 days. I had waited a long time for those 10 days, and I was not going to let Nadia's 4 minutes contaminate them. I decided that deliberately and maintained it. There were moments when what had happened tried to push through the surface of a meal or a morning on the water or an evening walk. And each time I let it exist briefly and then redirected my attention to where I actually was. James helped with that. He was good at being present and making presence feel like a choice rather than an obligation. But I spent time on the trip thinking about the 11 years, because the speech had forced me to do something I had never done properly before, which was examine the full length of the friendship with honesty about what I found. Nadia and I had met in the first week of university at an event neither of us wanted to attend. We had stood at the same wall at the same time and started talking because standing alone at a wall is easier when someone else is doing it beside you. By the end of that night, we had made plans for the following weekend, and by the end of that year, we were the kind of friends who shared everything. She was brilliant and funny and socially electric in a way I was not. People organized themselves around her attention. She moved through rooms like she understood the geometry of them. I had always found that quality fascinating and had never questioned what it cost to be adjacent to it. Examining the 11 years honestly, I found a pattern I had not previously assembled. Nadia shone most brightly when the people around her needed her. She was exceptional in a crisis. She arrived with the right words and the right wine and the right amount of time. She was present and generous and warm, and the warmth was real. I did not doubt the warmth. But the brightness dimmed in proportion to how well things were going for the people around her. She had been the most attentive during my bad years. During the period she had referenced in the speech, she had been closer than she had ever been before or since. She had shown up constantly. She had been indispensable. When that period ended and I rebuilt and moved forward, she had remained in my life, but something in the texture of our friendship had shifted. I had noticed it without naming it. A slight withdrawal. A quality of assessment in her eyes when I described good news that I had always read as privacy about her own life. Occasional comments that arrived lightly but landed differently. Things I had categorized as nothing because I did not want to examine them. I examined them now. I thought about the year James and I got engaged. Nadia had been the first person I called. She had been happy for me genuinely and audibly. But the weeks after had a different texture. She had opinions about the wedding that were strong in ways that created friction. She pushed back on choices I made and framed it as honesty. She was late to the engagement dinner we had planned with both families, and when she arrived, she made a comment about the restaurant that reframed the evening briefly. I had attributed all of it to her being opinionated, which she was, and to the stress of being a maid of honor, which was real. I had not attributed it to anything else because I had not wanted to. My friend Rosie, who had been at the wedding and who I had known for 6 years through work, called me on the third day of the honeymoon. I saw the call come in and let it go to voicemail and listened to it that evening. She said she was calling to check on me and also to say something she thought I should know. She said she had been at the table beside Nadia's during the speech. She said the expression on Nadia's face during my response at the microphone was not what she expected. She said she had expected embarrassment or remorse. She said what she saw instead was something that looked more like calculation, like Nadia was watching and measuring and assessing how the room was receiving things. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I set my phone down and watched the water and thought about what someone who genuinely loved you looked like when they watched you handle a moment they had created. I thought about what I was going to do with that information. I called Rosie back on the last day of the honeymoon. Rosie's full name is Rosalind, and she worked in communications at the same company I worked for, a mid-sized publishing house where I managed editorial operations. We had become friends through proximity and sustained each other through enough professional and personal circumstances that the friendship had genuine depth. She was analytical and fair-minded and not given to dramatic interpretations of events. Her voicemail about Nadia's expression was not gossip. It was an observation from someone who assessed things carefully before sharing them. I told her about the pattern I had been examining on the honeymoon. She listened and contributed her own observations about Nadia in the years she had known us both. Nothing definitive. Just texture that added to a picture I was developing. I came home from the honeymoon with James and resumed my actual life, which had not paused while Nadia had been standing at a microphone reordering it. I went back to work. I finished unpacking the last of James's things into the house we had shared since a year before the wedding. I walked Percy's counterpart in our household, a terrier named Biscuit who had opinions about everything, in the evenings when the weather allowed. I did not contact Nadia. She contacted me on the 6th day after we returned. A message rather than a call. The message said she had been thinking about what happened and wanted to talk. She said she understood I was probably upset and that her timing could have been better. She said she was worried about me and hoped we could speak soon. I read it once. I noticed the specific phrasing. Her timing could have been better. Not that what she said was wrong. Not that she should not have said it at all. Not that choosing my wedding as the venue for that particular disclosure was something she regretted. Just the timing. I showed the message to James without editorial comment. He read it and handed my phone back and said the phrasing told him most of what he needed to know about whether she understood what she had done. I did not respond to the message that day. I called my mother instead. My mother's name is Evelyn, and she had been at the wedding and had known Nadia for most of the 11 years. She was thoughtful about people in a way that usually required time before she offered an opinion. I had not pressed her in the days immediately after the wedding because I could tell she was processing. She was ready now. She told me she had replayed the speech several times in her memory and that what struck her most was the preparation in it. The way it built. The careful selection of what to include and what context to omit. The smile at the end. She said she had initially tried to read it as a lapse in judgment. A terrible combination of champagne and old resentments surfacing at the worst moment. She said the more she replayed it, the less she believed that reading. She said it looked planned. I told her I had been thinking the same thing. I spoke to a therapist named Gillian who I had seen occasionally over the years for the particular kind of thinking aloud that benefits from a structured space. She helped me separate what I knew from what I was inferring and what I felt from what I intended to do. She asked good questions about the friendship and what I actually wanted from the conversation I was eventually going to have with Nadia. She asked whether I wanted reconciliation or resolution. She said those were different goals and the conversation would look different depending on which one I was after. I sat with that for a day before I answered. I called Nadia 10 days after we returned home. I told her I was ready to talk and asked her to come to the house on Saturday afternoon. She said she would be there. Her voice had a quality of relief in it that I noted. She arrived on time. She was dressed carefully. She brought nothing, which struck me as a choice. Some people bring flowers or wine to a difficult conversation as a way of establishing goodwill at the door. Nadia arrived empty-handed, which was either oversight or a statement about how she was framing what we were walking into. We sat in the living room. I did not offer wine. I offered water and she took it, and we sat across from each other. I told her I had one question before anything else, and I wanted her to answer it honestly. I asked her if the speech was planned. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said it wasn't planned in the sense of being rehearsed in advance. She said she had been feeling things for a while and the emotions came out. I asked her what things. She talked for a while. Some of what she said was real. She had grievances going back years that she had never expressed, and the accumulation of them had apparently reached a threshold at a moment when the worst possible venue presented itself. Some of what she said was also revisionist, a reconstruction of events that positioned her as someone responding to injury rather than someone who had caused it. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not offer the responses she seemed to be angling for. When she finished, I told her I understood that she had feelings she had not addressed. I told her I also understood what she had done with those feelings and in what context and in front of how many people. I told her that those two things could both be true at the same time and that the second one did not become acceptable because of the first. She started to say something. I asked her to let me finish. I told her what I had decided. What I told Nadia on that Saturday afternoon was simple, and I had thought about every word in advance. I told her I was not going to end the conversation with anger because I did not have a sustainable amount of anger left for her, and because anger was not the thing that was going to be useful going forward. I told her I was also not going to pretend that what she did at my wedding was something I could absorb and move past in the way that earlier frictions in the friendship had been absorbed and moved past. I told her the scale was different, and I was not going to insult either of us by pretending otherwise. I told her I was not interested in a reconciliation at that time. She asked if I meant ever. I told her I meant for now, and that now was as far as I was prepared to look. She sat with that. I watched her process it. There was a moment where I thought she was going to push back, to make a case for herself, to offer the version of events that positioned us as two people who had hurt each other and therefore owed each other the effort of repair. She was good at that kind of framing. She had always been good at it. She didn't do it. She looked at her hands and then looked up and said she understood. She left 30 minutes later. Not hostile, not tearful in a performed way, just quieter than she had arrived. James asked how it went when he came home. I told him she had handled it with more dignity than the speech had suggested she was capable of. He said that was something at least. The professional dimensions of the situation required careful handling. Nadia and I did not work in the same company, but we operated in overlapping professional circles in the publishing industry and had mutual contacts who had been at the wedding and were going to have questions or observations or both. I thought about how to navigate this before it navigated itself. I made a simple decision. I was not going to discuss what Nadia had done with professional contacts. Not because I owed her protection, but because turning a personal situation into industry conversation would have required me to keep it active in ways that would cost me more than it cost her. Rosie understood this without my having to explain it. She flagged one situation where a mutual professional contact had asked her about the wedding, and she had simply said it was a beautiful ceremony and moved on. I thanked her for the judgment. My manager at the publishing house, a meticulous woman named Constance who had known me for 4 years and trusted my professional conduct completely, noticed a slight shift in my output in the weeks after the wedding and asked in a private moment whether I needed anything. I gave her the one-sentence version and she nodded and said to let her know and asked no further questions. The response from guests at the wedding was something I had not fully anticipated. I expected silence or awkward acknowledgement when I saw people. What I got instead was something more direct. Several people reached out in the weeks after to say they were sorry for what had happened and that the way I had handled it had stayed with them. James's aunt wrote me a card. His college friend sent a message that was brief and genuine. A cousin of mine who had been at the wedding called and said she had been thinking about my response and found herself drawing on it in an unrelated situation of her own. I had not stood up at the microphone expecting to give anyone anything. I had done it because sitting down felt wrong and because the story Nadia had told deserved to be completed by the person who actually lived it. But the responses reminded me that how you handle a public moment matters beyond the moment itself. Patricia, James's mother, came for dinner 6 weeks after the wedding. She was warm in a way that was more specifically warm than usual, which was her way of communicating something she would not say directly. At the end of the evening, she held my hand briefly and said James had chosen well. I thanked her. She said she meant it about the whole evening, not just the dinner. James's brother, who had handed me the microphone without hesitation, became someone I felt genuine affection for during those weeks. He had acted instinctively and correctly, and I told him so at the first family gathering after the honeymoon. He said he had not thought about it. He said the look on my face communicated clearly that I knew what I was doing, and he just made sure I had what I needed to do it. That was a correct reading. I had known what I was doing. Nadia sent one more message about a month after the Saturday conversation. She said she had been thinking and wanted me to know she was genuinely sorry. Not for the timing, for what she had done and why. She said she had started talking to someone and was trying to understand herself better. She said she didn't expect anything from me. She just wanted me to know. I read it twice. I did not respond immediately. Gillian and I talked about the message in our next session. She asked what I wanted to do with it. I told her I believed it was genuine. She asked whether believing it was genuine changed anything about where I was. I thought about that carefully. I told her it changed something small. Not the outcome. Not the distance I had established, but something in the texture of how I held the whole situation. The anger had been replaced a few weeks earlier by something cooler and more permanent. What Nadia's message did was make room for something that wasn't quite either. Not forgiveness yet. Not the resumption of anything. Just an acknowledgement that the person who had stood at the microphone with that smile was not the complete account of who Nadia was, and that the complete account was complicated in ways I didn't need to resolve immediately. That was as far as I was prepared to go. For now was still the answer. The first year of marriage is supposed to be difficult in the ordinary ways. The adjustment of two lives in close proximity. The negotiations around small habits that turn out to be significant. The recalibration of individual rhythms into something shared. James and I had all of that, plus the particular weight of having started the whole thing in a room that had gone quiet for the wrong reasons. We talked about it honestly and often. Not obsessively. But when it needed to come up, we let it come up rather than pushing it into a compartment labeled dealt with. James said early on that he thought the wedding had actually told him something useful. He said watching me stand up with the microphone gave him information about how I handled the worst version of a moment and that the information was good. I told him I was glad the worst version of a moment had been educational. He laughed. We were going to be okay. Rosie and I became closer during that year in the way that crises sometimes accelerate friendships that were already growing in that direction. She was practical and honest and did not require me to perform any particular emotional state around her. We had lunch most Thursdays and talked about work and books and the thousand small things that constitute an actual friendship. She was there for the substance of the days rather than just the emergencies. I thought about that often in the context of Nadia. The way Nadia had been present for emergencies and somehow less available for the ordinary texture. The way Rosie was available for both. The difference told me something about what I had been accepting as friendship that was actually something else. At work, I was given an expanded role 8 months after the wedding. A restructuring had created a new position overseeing editorial strategy across 3 imprints, and Constance offered it to me before it was posted externally. She said my judgment was exactly what the role needed. I accepted and spent the following months building something I was proud of. The work absorbed me in the particular way that good work does when it is the right work at the right time. I had the mental space for it that I might not have had if the wedding situation had consumed me the way it could have. Choosing early to handle the situation cleanly rather than letting it run had preserved the capacity I needed for everything else. James noticed and said so. He said I was good at not letting one thing eat everything else. I told him I had learned it from difficult practice. My mother visited in the spring. She and I walked around the neighborhood one afternoon while James was working, and she asked me, carefully, how I was doing with the Nadia situation. I told her where I had landed, that I held it with some complexity now, that the anger had resolved into something more like understanding, a clear-eyed understanding rather than a soft one but not active pain. She said she was glad. She said she had watched me stand up at the microphone and had thought in that moment, through her own shock at what Nadia had done, that she was watching her daughter become the person she had hoped I would become. I told her I had learned most of what I knew about handling things from watching her. She did the thing she always did when she was moved, which was change the subject to something practical. We talked about the garden for the rest of the walk. James's friend group absorbed me slowly and genuinely, which I appreciated because forced warmth is exhausting and genuine warmth takes time and is worth waiting for. His friend Marcus, who had been at the wedding and had sent a message afterward, became someone I enjoyed spending time with. His college friend Theo, who had also been there, had an easy humor that made group dinners with James's friends feel like something I wanted rather than something I attended. A small thing happened 10 months after the wedding that I have thought about since. I was at an industry event and ran into a woman I knew casually, an editor named Patricia from a different house who had heard about the wedding through the professional network. She mentioned it obliquely and said she had heard I had handled a difficult situation with remarkable composure. I told her I had done what seemed right in the moment. She said she had been at her own version of a difficult public moment several years earlier and had not handled it well and still thought about it. She said watching someone else get it right, even as an account she heard secondhand, had mattered to her. I thought about that for a long time after the conversation. The way a single public moment, handled one way rather than another, sent ripples in directions you never saw. Rosie's voicemail, James's aunt's card, his brother handing me the microphone without hesitation, Patricia at an industry event telling me it mattered. None of it was why I had stood up. I had stood up because sitting down was wrong. But what it produced beyond the immediate moment was something I had not anticipated and something I was grateful for in retrospect. Gillian and I concluded our regular sessions at the end of that year. She said I had done the work I came in to do and that the healthy thing was to leave rather than maintain a dependency that had served its purpose. I thanked her for the directness. She said to come back if I needed to. I went home that evening and made dinner with James, and we ate with the back door open because it was warm enough, and Biscuit sat in the doorway supervising the garden with his usual authority. James asked how the session had gone. I told him Gillian said I was done. He said that tracked with what he had been watching over the past year. I asked what he meant. He said the person who walked out of the hotel the morning after the wedding carrying what Nadia had done was not quite the person sitting across from him now. He said the difference was hard to name precisely. Something about weight, about what I was still carrying versus what I had set down. I thought about the microphone, the 214 people, the quiet that came before I stood up, the speech I gave and the words I chose and the voice I kept steady. I thought about what it had cost and what it had produced and what it turned out not to have taken. The friendship was gone. That was a real loss. 11 years was real. The warmth in it had been real. I did not pretend otherwise. But I had stood up in the middle of the worst moment of the most important day and told my own story with my own voice, and the room had held. I had chosen what came next and handled it at the pace that was actually honest and built the year that followed from exactly where I stood. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything that mattered.